Institute here at Lancaster University, giving us his insight about researching SMEs in China. Shihai, it's nice to see you again.
Yes, nice to see you, Alan, and also my pleasure to talk to our students.
Thank you. Today, well, we are very much interested about, we have been talking a lot about SMEs, and one of the key interesting aspects is about SMEs around the world. And I'd like to ask you about SMEs in China. What is the relevance of SMEs in China?
Yeah, of course, like SMEs in other countries, they contribute largely to the Chinese economy. As I believe many of you have already known, China is now the second largest economy in the world. The contribution of SME, no doubt, is critical to its success over the last 30 years. And also another interesting point is in terms of definition of SMEs. And then we know in the EU or most European countries, we see firms with employees of less than 250, right, as SMEs. But in the Chinese context, it's more complex. It looks at two criteria, two key criteria. One is, of course, the number of employees, and the second thing is to look at the output of assets of the firms. So, in whichever case, China, according to these two criteria, now has registered small and medium-sized enterprises of more than 4.3 million, and it contributed to 60% of its GDP and 50% of tax revenues. And also, you know, as we said earlier, the importance of the Chinese economy in the world. One aspect is about its export. And SMEs contributed to about 68%, close to 70% of China's exports. And also in terms of employment, it provides 3/4 of new jobs every year. So in this case, of course, not simply in terms of the number of SMEs in the Chinese economy, but also in terms of its contribution to the GDP, to its national economy, and also to jobs. So no doubt, as we said earlier, compared with some other countries, similarly, the Chinese SMEs contribute largely to its economy.
Right. I think it's extremely interesting because you mentioned that China is such a vast country, and we are just starting perhaps to really understand the real importance of SMEs, especially in a country, you know, with such a large extension. What do you think? What do you think makes the Chinese SMEs so unique?
And I think this is a very interesting question. It will help us understand more about SMEs in China if you look at the context of SMEs. And if you know slightly about the history of China, of course, it has a long history. But also, if you look at the current government, the Communist Party, we call it, it was established in 1949. And then with the communist ideology, starting from 1950s, the Chinese government started the nationalization process. So by the end of 1970s, I wouldn't say all, but most of firms in China were state-owned enterprises. So not until, as I said earlier, late 1970s, China started its open and reform policy. Starting from then on, and then you could see, of course, the private sector. And then the other interesting point relevant to this is when we talk about state SMEs, they are mostly private firms. So you can see the difference between the state-owned enterprises and also private sector that is largely small and medium-sized enterprises. So that's one thing. And also relevant to this, in terms of relatively short history of small and medium-sized enterprises, you could see almost very rapid development, also expansion over the last 3 decades. So that's another very, very unique. And also relevant to the other point I've just said, the private sector, most of them, small and medium-sized enterprises in China, are also family businesses. This is another, as you can see, is a combination of different characteristics. And then the third one, which also is very interesting, and also it is another aspect of the Chinese approach or competitive advantage, is about its clustering process. If you know more about China, most successful firms, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, and of course, mostly privately owned and also family businesses, are located in the eastern coastal areas, right? And then another important concept is clustering. Not simply in terms of the traditional clustering approach we see in the West. For instance, when we look at the value chain, right, with industry or businesses in a similar industry, or if you can see from the supply chain, in different stages of the development. But also in China, interestingly, many small towns, for instance, developed from a small village into a specialized particular industry. For instance, in one town in Zhejiang, a coastal city, it supplies about 3/4 of zippers in the world. So you can see, most firms in the same town do similar businesses. So that's another thing. It will be very interesting for us to know. And then a fourth point is apparently China, as I said, is a large country, of course, with huge population. So the development of small and medium-sized enterprises is very relevant to the population. That's why you can see mostly when we talk about the word of factory, they are mostly labor-intensive firms. That will be another key point. And then in terms of this business environment, apart from what we said earlier, sort of discrimination against the private sector. Of course, as I said, since the open reform policy, the Chinese government have tried hard to promote the private sector. But on the other hand, that is sort of a path dependency approach. It takes time for people to change their mindset, to change their attitude or discrimination against the private sector. Apart from difficulty of access financial support, for instance, of course, it simply has to face the sector. Has to face the other problems like newness of doing business or start up business, and also to face fierce or even uneven competition from the state-owned sector, and particularly since the about 10 years ago, the Chinese government, as I said, tried to promote the development of the small and medium-sized enterprises. It had a law passed to promote this sector, but on the other hand, the Chinese government still tried to protect the so-called strategic industries. And apparently all these sectors are mostly for or solely for the state-owned enterprises. And the small and medium-sized enterprises, as I said, mostly private firms, are not allowed to step in these industries. So that's why you could see, on the other hand, for instance, state-owned enterprises are given favorable policies, not simply in terms of financial support, but of course market access, etc. So given all this, you can see small and medium-sized enterprises have to work extra hard to compete against, of course, state-owned enterprises and also even foreign investigative firms. And also you could see, more interestingly, how in such a discriminated environment, Chinese small and medium-sized enterprises can survive, develop, and expand so rapidly and contribute so largely to the Chinese economy.
So, I mean,
yeah, I hope more or less I have addressed your questions. We need to understand